It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Gordon Crovitz. He's probably best known to most of you who look forward, as I do, to reading his Information Age column in the Wall Street Journal. He's actually been nice enough to write a column this week that is going to jibe with some of the things that we're going to be discussing, particularly tomorrow. But in a sense, actually, that's only a minor part of his resume. He's a former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, executive vice president of Dow Jones, president of its consumer media group. He's also co-founder of Press Plus, which was recently acquired by R.R. Donnelley. He's been active in digital media since the early 1990s, overseeing the growth of the Wall Street Journal online to more than 1 million paying subscribers, making WSJ.com the largest paid news site on the web. He's a member of several boards of directors, including ProQuest, Business Insider, and Marin Software, and is an active investor in early-stage companies in the news and information industries. Earlier in his career, Gordon wrote the Rule of Law column for the Journal. He was editor and publisher of the Far Eastern Economic Review, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal Europe. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago and has law degrees from Wadham College in Oxford, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar, and Yale Law School. The title of his talk today is "For Aught We Know, Why Technology Moves Too Fast for Washington." Gordon.
Tom, thank you very much, and I am glad that the gods have conspired to give us more light and more sun than we had downstairs. It's really a pleasure to be here to address this group. I'm especially glad because the theme for my talk is that the organizer of this conference, a Technology Policy Institute, really has one of the tougher jobs, which is trying to help determine the best policies for technology. But as we all know, technology moves so rapidly and so unpredictably in so many unexpected directions, it's hard really for anybody to keep up. It's hard for technology entrepreneurs, it's hard for policy advisors, it's hard for regulators, it's hard for lawmakers. It's not hard for columnists. The reason it's not hard for columnists is all we're responsible for is having an opinion, which is easy to have. So I want to talk about this topic of technology policy. I want to give you a little bit of background about my own bias, which comes after spending 30 years or so in a news industry, being among those many industries significantly impacted by the fast pace of technology. For those of you old enough to remember when the news industry was mostly analog, you'd get a printed thing on your driveway or on your desk. It would have type, mostly black and white, sometimes color. The printed newspaper, that had a product life cycle of about 100 years. So not a tremendous amount of innovation in most communities, whether it was a interest community like the Wall Street Journal with business professionals or geographical communities. There really wasn't all that much competition. And nothing really changed much on the revenue side either, really supported by advertisers who we now know simply had no better alternatives than newspapers or magazines, or I would say now broadcasters. So I want to address this group as somebody who lived through massive disruptions in an industry that knew the change was happening even before it happened, but continues really to have a very hard time keeping up. And it's been surprising and yet I would say somewhat reassuring to see how quickly so many new media companies have now joined newspapers as old media companies. Yahoo and AOL were disruptive forces at one time. MySpace was dislodged by Facebook. Google came up with a great new advertising model which funded new technology that allows it to dominate search. Apple is now a dominant player even in telecommunications. Venture capitalists and others whose job it is to spot the next thing have a really hard time picking winners and losers. So when it comes to policy making, it seems to me the faster an industry changes, the harder it has to be to find the right policy and the greater the risk of embracing the wrong policy. So this suggests to me that the prime directive for technology policy should be similar to the prime directive of medicine, which is first, do no harm. This is not a new idea. I think we look around the world and the challenges for technology policymakers, and we think this is really a new world, and of course in many ways it is, but there were eras that were somewhat similar to our own. And I want to take us back just briefly to the pre-internet era, mid-19th century. It's been referred to as the Victorian internet, and this has to do with a Supreme Court case brought by Samuel Morse. You'll all know Samuel Morse as the innovator behind the Morse code. He had a case in the Supreme Court relating to patents, a topic that continues to vex us, relating to patents having to do with the telegraph. The technology problem in the 19th century for the telegraph was that it would have required thousands of volts and very high currents to send a message, say, from Aspen to Denver or Baltimore to Washington. Morse had the great idea of introducing what he called repeaters, what we now call relays. These had independent batteries that overcame the problem of diminishing force of electromagnetism across long currents. And the patent claim that Morse made, which I'm going to read from, included the following, and see if this doesn't sound like a new technology to you. The essence of my invention, he said, being the use of the motive power of the electric or galvanic current, which I call electromagnetism, however developed for marking or printing intelligible characters, signs, letters, at any distance, being a new application of the power of which I claim to be the first inventor or discoverer. Now, this was such a broad claim that it would have covered not just the telegraph, but also any later electrical or digital invention for sending characters, signs, and letters at any distance using electricity. That would, of course, have included the internet, but Morse and his heirs, regrettably, did not get the patent that he sought. And the decision of a majority of Supreme Court justices in 1853, so this is not a current case, but I think current wisdom, in 1853 included this passage in thinking about Samuel Morse's application. The court said, "For aught we now know, some future inventor in the onward march of science may discover a mode of writing or printing at a distance by means of the electric or galvanic current, without using any of the processes or combinations set forth in the plaintiff's specification." Now, the phrase "for aught we now know" sounds a bit quaint. We'd probably update that to "heck, for all we know." But the point is the same, and I think it's a great way to think about the pace of technology. The Supreme Court over 100 years ago said, for all anybody knows, the telegraph with its electrical relays is not going to be the last word on communicating, on sending messages great long distances. This case is somewhat familiar for the general proposition that you're not supposed to be able to patent a mere idea. And I think it is more generally of great interest for any policy wonks, which I think includes everybody in this courtyard. If you want to read it, Google either O'Reilly against Morse, O'Reilly v. Morse, or more simply the telegraph patent case. I think you'll find it very amusing. And as technology policies arise, I'd recommend that we all begin those discussions with two things: a deep breath followed by the phrase, "for aught we now know." I think this will keep us humble, as the FT Commissioner mentioned earlier today, will keep us humble when we think about claims to know how technology will develop, or how we as consumers of technology will adapt to it, will feel about it. And I want to touch briefly on three matters of policy dispute where I think we really could use some more "for aught we now know." These are not religion and sex, which are controversial enough, but for this group, patents, privacy, and antitrust. So first, patents. I think the current controversies obviously include whether software should ever be entitled to patents, whether business processes should be patentable. I think what we now know, at the very least, is that there's a big difference between software and other industries. We heard some comments along these lines in the panel just before this session. In software, it's almost axiomatic that advances are built one upon another. Keeping track of patents is so hard that at many technology companies, developers and engineers are told by the legal department, don't worry about it. Forget about it. You're not going to know. Don't think about the patents. A senior lawyer for Google has estimated that in every smartphone, there are 250,000 patented pieces. How will you know if you violated one of them? This certainly helps to explain, by the way, the massive Apple, Google, Samsung litigation. My favorite legal commentary on this, by the way, comes from Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit, who, in dismissing a case between Apple and Google, had this to say, quote, "That's all we need is new actions, new suits, because there's not enough litigation worldwide between Apple and Android." So when even a judge like Dick Posner makes fun of the legal system, there's probably something wrong. So if I have a, well, this is not the venue to work out all the issues relating to patent, so let me do say that one way to be humble about this issue is to recognize that software is very different from some other industries. We talked about the pharmaceutical industry at the panel earlier. In the pharmaceutical industry, there is actually a published database, very detailed, about additions to patents, who invented what. It's quite possible for a researcher to know exactly who owns what intellectual property when it comes to the development of drugs. This is very different from software. So with our "for aught we now know" hats on, it seems to me the policy implication is to do no harm, which implies, at the very least, taking a new look at patent law and asking whether it should be the same in every industry, even with what we now know about how different industries are. And as an aside, I would say the same thing about copyright law. Earlier this year, as you know, Congress came close to passing the SOPA legislation to reduce online piracy. The law was withdrawn when it became clear that among its provisions might lead to some architecturing of the web and some other issues. And I think, as with SOPA, the best response to the exponential pace of technological change that we think of as Moore's Law is, whenever you see Moore's Law in action, don't think more law. The right reaction to Moore's Law is often actually less law. So if I haven't been controversial enough, and I do my best to be controversial, let me turn to the sensitive topic of privacy. As you know, one of the great things about digital technology, and also one of the terrifying things about digital technology, is that data is now collected about all of us in ways that, while literally, would have been unimaginable a few years ago. Marketers use the digital information about us all to deliver highly targeted marketing messages to us. We get ads very focused on our inferred interests and preferences. In exchange, we get wonderful free services. We get free email, free entertainment, free websites of all kinds. Most adults in America now have Facebook accounts. That's all about sharing personal information. People obviously like sharing information with each other. I think, on the other hand, as consumers, we're also learning a hard truth, which is that if we're not the ones paying for a service, we're the product being sold. There's certainly what people refer to as a creepy factor with targeted advertising. Those of us who use Gmail, it's good fun to see what ads are inferred alongside based on what we type in Gmail messages. It's a little bit creepy, but creepy is not necessarily a bad thing and not necessarily unlawful. And consumer expectations about privacy have changed enormously. So I want to go back to the 19th century, again, an era when technology changed people's views about privacy, or at least led to a rethinking of privacy. The technology of the day at that time included newspapers. That was a kind of new technology, at least mass newspapers, and a technology called the camera, photo cameras, photography. The most famous law review ever on privacy was written in 1890 in the Harvard Law Review by Louis Brandeis, who was later Supreme Court Justice, and by his then legal partner, Samuel Warren. Samuel Warren actually turns out to be a fascinating character. He was a member of the Boston aristocracy. He had married the daughter of a former Secretary of State. He was a member of the Brahmin group in Boston. And the Warren family was outraged when the local media began to take an interest in their social affairs. They began to cover their events at their home. They were apparently especially offended by a newspaper account in Boston of a breakfast that the Warrens held at their home to celebrate the wedding of a relative. And their home was so filled with flowers that the local newspaper described it as a veritable floral bower. In the 19th century, that was considered scurrilous libel, highly offensive to the Warren family. And in their law review article calling for legislation to protect privacy, Brandeis and Warren complained that, quote, instantaneous photographs and newspaper enterprise have invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life. The press is overstepping in every direction the obvious bounds of propriety and decency, unquote. Now, as a former publisher of the Wall Street Journal, I'm not that into gossipy journalism either, but they surely went too far in proposing a new common law standard of privacy. They wanted laws that would, quote, protect the privacy of the individual from invasion either by the too enterprising press, the photographer, or the possessor of any other modern device for recording or reproducing scenes or sounds, unquote. Imagine if that law had taken effect. What would you see on Facebook? There'd be nothing posted on Pinterest. We'd have to get reams of contracts signed before we took photographs that included strangers. So under an approach of for aught that we now know, it seems to me that the policy recommendation in the area of privacy, even in an area where people do see some creepiness factor, should simply be to give consumers as much choice as they can possibly get about how much privacy they're willing to exchange for other benefits, but to not lock in a one-size-fits-all approach to that trade-off. People should be able to choose how much information they want to share, what they don't want to share. Choice-making, not law-making, should be the theme. So finally, how should we think about antitrust issues relating to technology? Let me start by saying that if you think back about the great issue of the late 1990s, early 2000s in antitrust and technology, that was the great Microsoft case, which in some precincts actually still continues. And it's very hard at this juncture to remember exactly what the issues were or in what ways Microsoft dominated the industry, which of course in many ways it did. I think the longest term impact of that case was to distract Microsoft management to take their eye off the ball for later developments, including the internet. So last week, as you may have read, Google acquired Frommer's Travel Guide, which, as my column in today's Wall Street Journal describes it, was by any normal measure a modest acquisition, and modest probably overstates it. Google paid about $25 million, compared with its annual revenues last year of $38 billion, and compared with the travel industry revenues of $2 trillion. So a teeny tiny acquisition. And yet consumer groups called on the government to review the antitrust implications. The group fairsearch.org issued a release that's backed by companies including Microsoft, which learned from the 1990s that if somebody's going to be accused of antitrust, it should be somebody else. It asked for different government agencies to look closely into how Google uses this acquisition to in ways that might be anti-competitive. And as you all know, the Federal Trade Commission is in the midst of a very large antitrust review of Google, and Google plans to use, as they have said, content from Frommer's. They also bought Zagat's. You may be familiar with the little red guides, which is also quite active online. And last year, 2 years ago, they also bought a large software service that has information about travel. They're trying to address the next evolution in search, I think, which is that it's great that we can get 27 million search results in 0.3 seconds, but wouldn't it be even better if we got an answer right away? And I think Google is now focused on that, trying to deliver inferred answers, or answers to the questions that it infers we're actually trying to answer. And by the way, doing that at some risk to their business model. Right? The business model of a search engine is paid search. If somebody gets the answer to what they're looking for without having to worry about the paid search, it's a potential impact on revenue. Sites like TripAdvisor and Travelocity worry that Google is going to send them less traffic. Google's chairman Eric Schmidt testified in Washington last year, "We built search for users, not websites." thus no doubt inviting investigation. And it seems to me that an approach of fraught that we now know should support the idea that if antitrust is to support consumers and not competitors, that companies should be allowed to continue to innovate in this way. And if a search engine wants to become an answer engine, if that increases consumer benefit, even if it inconveniences competitors or reduces their market cap, as happened last week, that is the way it's supposed to go. The FTC actually, I think, possibly coincidentally, possibly not, I don't know, is moving in the opposite direction. And as I think some of you probably know, last month took a step in another direction in antitrust by rescinding a policy that it had had since 2003 on the question of when the FTC would seek disgorgement for alleged antitrust violations. In 2003, the agency said, we're very rarely going to seek disgorgement. We don't have clear standards for it. It's a very tough, costly remedy. We're just not going to pursue it very often. Last month, a majority of the commissioners changed that rule, and this may or may not be related to the investigation of Google, but FTC Commissioner Maureen Olhausen, who was on the panel just before us and is with us today, dissented. She said that the 2003 policy had worked quite well, and she objected that a return to disgorgement under conditions that the agency refused to define, quote, runs counter to the goal of transparency, which is an important factor in ensuring ongoing support for the agency's mission and activities. And she warned, in essence, we are moving from clear guidance on disgorgement to virtually no guidance on this important policy issue. I think that was exactly right. A directive to do no harm in a fast-moving industry would include a commitment, an especially strong commitment, to a clear rule of law with regards to antitrust, with clear standards and clear remedies. For the technology companies that are supposed to be the driver of our economy, this kind of regulatory uncertainty creates burdens that are hard to quantify. We have a lot of economists here. Perhaps it is quantifiable, but certainly slows down innovation. So any of you who've been listening closely to what I've had to say may have begun to suspect that I see no role for government in any of these questions at all. That would be a gross overstatement. I do see a role for government in this area. The one thing I think we do know enough about at this stage of the development of the internet is that the decentralized management of the internet has been an extraordinary and great achievement. It is a permissionless medium. You don't need to go out and get a license to post stuff on the web. There are no special taxes that are required. It's a very free and open medium. The presumption is that people are left free to innovate. There is, therefore, a very important role for the U.S. government in maintaining the openness of the web, which is that the U.S. government, while not alone, is very certainly in a minority of the 193 members of the United Nations in having that attitude toward the virtues of an open and largely unregulated internet. There are proposals for the World Conference on International Telecommunications in December, part of the ITU. We also talked about that earlier in this conference. And according to leaked proposals, unsurprisingly, countries like China and Russia and Iran hope to use this process to rope in the internet, make it less open, to legitimize some of their censorship and closing of the internet. The Chinese want to legitimate government censorship with a proposal to give each country authority over, quote, information and communication infrastructure within their state. Not a very global internet kind of idea. Russia, some Arab countries propose a right to inspect communications that go along the internet, including private emails. Others want to create a new tax on the usage of the internet, typically billing from the originating country, which would serve the goal of a less global internet. This is all to those of us of a certain age reminiscent of the analog era, pre-internet era days of what was then called the New Information World Order, where the Soviet Union and its allies tried to use international policymaking forums to increase government control over information flows. At that time, the U.S. stood its ground. The U.S. even left one of the UN agencies, UNESCO, for many years, in objection to those efforts to close off communication. So that was a kind of quick review of a do no harm approach to technology. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate the skies not opening up. Even if none of you agrees with everything that I have said, perhaps some of you will agree with some of what I said. And even if you don't agree with anything I said about patents or privacy or antitrust or the role of the US and the UN, I hope you will at least take a moment and reread some of that 19th century jurisprudence, which I think still has a lot to tell us. I think it is still true that nobody can predict the next innovations in technology, that entrepreneurs should be largely free to innovate and to create new products and services unless there's an extraordinarily good reason to stop them. For aught that we now know, too many rules and regulations surely will reduce the benefits of technology. Thank you. I'd be very happy to take any easy questions. Eric.
Thank you. That was terrific, and I especially like what you're saying about the open internet and the threats of various governments to close it. There are also ways that private organizations can create walled gardens and closed internet. What is your view on whether or not that's something we should just let happen, or is that something that we should keep an eye on? If Facebook is very successful in creating a walled garden where the users send email to each other within it, and there's an ecosystem of currency within it, is the best policy to just let that go, or is there something we should be looking at more closely there?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic marketing opportunity for for others in the market. I do not think that the government should decree that Facebook move off of its walled garden any more than I thought it should do the same thing for AOL or CompuServe or anybody else. I think consumers do find such benefit from open platforms that people who use open platforms will have significant benefits. I think in my industry, the news and information industry, people who have tried to create closed garden sources of news have found that very difficult. The people have come to expect hyperlinks and other ways to get more information quickly and easily with very little friction. So I think we may be in a world where there are some closed gardens, Facebook obviously being a leading example of that. But it's very hard for me to see how even the smartest people in the world represented here could possibly come up with what the rules of the road should be as between open and closed systems, or to create incentives to promote one against the other. I think the market has done a terrific job of that so far, and will continue to do that. And my own sneaking suspicion, for whatever it's worth, is that we often see companies do extraordinarily well in the early days of their being because they have found something really fantastically new and interesting, as Facebook obviously has. But as companies get to a certain level of growth, and as shareholders and others demand continued growth, that sometimes what made them strong in the past slows them down. We see this, I think, in more mature industries like the industry for real-time financial information, where companies like Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters had at one time been themselves quite closed gardens, and they're moving inexorably to being much more open because their consumers demand it, even though it requires a change in their business model. So I think this is one of these. It's a great debate, and I think it's fantastic, especially for consumers to understand what the benefits of more open platforms are. But I would think that over time, more open is going to trump more closed.
Thanks for that great talk and for bringing us back to 1890. I guess that was the second more recent decision from the 1853, but Brandeis and Warren and their development of the common law tort of invasion of privacy and so on. Do you think that there's a risk of that type of thinking infusing the current regulatory and litigation environment too much so by making intangible harms, the so-called creepiness factor, kind of the standard for what should be enforced, what should be litigated? There's a lot of private litigation these days, much of which has been foundering on the question of what's the harm. But the Federal Trade Commission in the last couple of years has stressed intangible harms. Perhaps what the Warren family was thinking in terms of not appreciating their private family events being intruded upon. Yes. But do you see a risk of that type of thinking returning and closing off too much internet activity?
Yeah, no, I think it's an extremely conservative way of thinking. This is conservative not in our modern terms, but in a resistant to change approach, a fearing the unknown approach. I think we see a lot of it. And I think there's a great hint in exactly what you say, Alan, which is if there's no obvious harm to a consumer, what exactly is the basis for the litigation? And when you track a lot of these cases, as the lawyers among you know, these are cases brought by lawyers, settled by companies that also have legal bills to pay if they don't settle, where some of the amount then goes to the lobbying groups that call themselves privacy groups to help encourage their lobbying. So to me, it's an unhealthy use of the legal system for a wrong that may or may not be a legal wrong, but at the very least ought to go to trial once or twice to see what juries think, to see what people actually think about privacy. And I would also say that if you look at the behavior of all of us as consumers, if we're given the option to aggressively clear our cookies, to use multiple browsers, to use Tor or some other device really to be anonymous, even to click on the little icon on an ad that says, what are my privacy issues here? None of us do that. I wrote a column a couple of years ago where I had to use a very sophisticated TI device to come up with the percentage of people who had ever taken advantage of it. It was 0.000002. It was almost nobody, probably mostly people who were interested in the policy topic. So I think as consumers, people evolve very quickly to adopt a different trade-off. And I could be wrong about this. It could be that there could be a competitor to a Facebook, for example, that would have very different privacy rules and would compete on that basis. And there are some early stage companies that are trying to compete on the basis of better privacy. I think that's great. It gives consumers better choice. But I think that's the way to work through these issues rather than very amorphous, vague, quasi-legal standards.
Thanks. Patrick Wilson with the Semiconductor Industry Association. My question is about the Moore's Law pace of change in politicians. One of the worries that we have when going to the Hill to talk about technology policy is that, well, don't worry, Congressman, the market will solve this problem for you. And I wonder if you could take what you just said and put that in the space of the here versus there. Many of the companies that are very interested in technology policy, they're stuck here. Their customers are here. They have to deal with our regulatory environment. Many companies don't. And it's a question of where will I serve my customers? Will I serve them from Palo Alto or will I serve them from Shenzhen? Yeah. And I'm wondering how, I guess, you would look at that on the challenge to impact the policy climate whenever you have that here versus there dynamic.
Yeah. I think it's a great question, and I think, especially in the U.S., we tend to look at our own regulatory regime, and we're very focused on it. It's a big country. It's very influential, et cetera, et cetera. There are regulatory regimes in other parts of the world that have maybe newer entrants into some of these areas that have a much lighter touch, that might be a better model for us. I'm thinking particularly of countries in Asia, not China, but the regulatory regime in a Hong Kong or maybe a Singapore has a thing or two to teach us. It's very hard from where we now are to move to a radically different regulatory regime. Washington does not move at a Moore's Law pace, we know. But I think in a world of, especially the world of digital technology, which is largely global, it is very much like the 19th century issue of free trade, free capital, free movement of labor. It's very hard to bottle stuff up. It's very hard to have a less competitive regulatory regime and remain competitive. I think the US, because we're so large and so affluent, we can get away with an inefficient regulatory regime longer than we otherwise could, but it doesn't go on forever. So I think in a world of global competition, you know, it's not just entrenched companies in the U.S. having to deal with entrenched regulators worried about upstart competitors. It ought to be our regulators worrying about, are they providing the best regulatory regime in the world for innovation? And I think at this time, the answer has to be no. And how quickly can we become more competitive is the question.
Hi, my name is Anjana. I'm an undergraduate student, and you were very right when you said 0.00% of us take advantage of all the features that you have, and clear our cookies. And I'm thinking when you talk about the evolution of the consumer, who does that onus fall on to make sure that we evolve as consumers? The education of what is digital citizenship? How do you become an aware consumer? Is that Capitol Hill's responsibility? Is that the responsibility of companies in Silicon Valley? And how should we think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't think I have a full answer to it. I think, you know, younger people who've grown up with these technologies come at them with some assumptions that are probably a bit different than older folks. I think they assume a level of transparency and lack of privacy that older people maybe don't assume. I could be wrong about that. That's my personal view of it. I do think there is a role for government in this respect that I think, you know, those of us who, when we see a privacy policy on a website or some other digital product and we have to read 30 or 40 screens before, you know, and then we click I agree, and actually all we do is we click I agree. Has anybody ever done that? That is motivated by a combination of regulation and fear of litigation. And the length of those agreements is dictated by the dysfunction of our legal system. So the regulatory regime has actually discouraged effective education by making fun of the whole topic. So I would much rather a system would evolve where people could actually understand different privacy policies, where the disclosure might be at a much higher level, much less detailed, but more worried about educating and less worried about litigation. But how we get from here to there, I think is very hard. It's driven by lawyers and driven by the fear of litigation. Thank you.
Well, we did, I guess we have been lucky, so we did luck out. The breakout sessions start at 2, and they're downstairs. And there are 3 breakout sessions, and if you go downstairs, you'll find out where each of them is. One of them is on copyright and piracy, one of them is on internet economics, and one of them is on cybersecurity. So we will see you in a few minutes.